feel bad for you.
I don't think about you at all.
Christopher Edward Nolan is perhaps today's most influential and world-renowned filmmaker. For over 20 years, he has consistently produced original, critically acclaimed, and commercially successful films, all of which have been highlighted by practical effects, dedicated filmmaking techniques, powerful scores, and visual spectacle. He is a director fond of non-linear structures and has mentioned that this choice is inspired by a music writing technique known as the shepherd tone.
And so the structure I settled on is based on a musical structure called the shepherd tone, which is a musical illusion whereby you can keep climbing up the scale, but you never seem to go out of reach, if you like. And I wanted to try and apply that to screenwriting.
But what I like most about his work is his knack for storytelling, specifically unconventional and thought-provoking storytelling. In my opinion, his latest film, Oppenheimer, was a masterpiece. Usually, I freak the fuck out when I see new movies with runtimes over 2.5 hours.
Anita, darling, my darling.
Save Martha!
But I thought Oppenheimer used every second perfectly. I've only watched it once, but thought it was well acted, stunning visually, provoked tension, conveyed thoughtful messages about man's existence, ego, and power. It's just dope that Nolan has the pizzazz to get people into theaters to watch a historical drama. So I immediately got to thinking, Chris Nolan has clearly still got it, but just a few years ago, I was very underwhelmed by Tenet. For sure, that movie suffered from the fact that it was dropped on HBO Max during a pandemic, but nonetheless, I left the movie feeling like I don't really want to watch it or even think about it ever again. It definitely felt like the audience was supposed to be invested more in the concept itself instead of the story, which is a hard sell for me. Or maybe it's just too smart for a jabroni like myself, but in the end, it just wasn't my cup of tea. So naturally, I start to think about things. I loved Oppenheimer, but I thought Tenet was Nolan's weakest film to date. What gives? Oppenheimer was adapted by Nolan from a book called American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, while Tenet was an original script conceived by Nolan over the course of 20 years, a film for which Nolan is credited as the sole writer, much like another movie that we'll talk about later. So now a hypothesis enters my mind. Are Christopher Nolan's movies where he collaborates with other writers or adapts stories better than the movies where he is given creative free rein from the studios? Or are his movies where he receives sole writing credit his best work?
What Emma and I have found over the years works well for us is to, start watching the film ourselves at the end of every editing week and bring in individuals, people who haven't read the script, don't know, like one person at a time, and just watch the film with them.
When you take a look at his catalog, his films essentially fall into one of three categories. 1. Original movies penned solely by Chris Nolan. 2. Original screenplays conceived by Nolan and his brother. Or 3. Movies that are adapted from a book or other work which may or may not have included additional writers. And before I go any further, I know no movie could possibly be the sole work of one individual, regardless of how it is credited. But I was interested if there are any similarities between the films that Nolan carried the bulk of the lift on. Christopher Nolan has directed 12 movies to date and has received a writing credit on every one of them except for Insomnia, which was written by Hilary Sates and based on a Norwegian film by the same name. He received sole writing credit on the following original scripts: Following, Inception, Dunkirk, and Tenet. He worked with his brother Jonathan Nolan to pen the original script Interstellar, and the two of them also collaborated to write The Prestige, which is based on a book by Christopher Priest, and both The Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises, with David Goyer receiving a story credit on each. Batman Begins was written by both David Goyer and Christopher Nolan. He is also credited as the sole screenwriter on Memento and Oppenheimer. However, the former is based off a short story written by his brother Jonathan, and the latter, as I've mentioned, is based off a novel and, well, history. So essentially, his original movies he penned alone are Following, Interstellar, and Tenet. His adapted movies he wrote alone are Oppenheimer, and although it's not based on a book, I'm going to include Dunkirk in this category because it's based off a historical event. And quick aside, I believe this to be his most ambitious project. It's also worth noting that it's his shortest script, since there's very little dialogue in the film. From a critical perspective, Rotten Tomatoes ranks his top 5 as Oppenheimer, The Dark Knight, Memento, Insomnia, and Dunkirk. And most other rankings I have found usually include a variation of 4 out of 5 of those, with a handful of critics electing to replace Insomnia with either Interstellar or The Prestige. Nolan's highest grossing films are The Dark Knight Rises, The Dark Knight, Inception, Interstellar, and Oppenheimer. So we have a good mix of his different movies across critical and commercial success, but I'd give a slight edge to his adapted screenplays. However, let's see if we can learn anything by digging a little deeper.
I'm not gonna stand here, present some egghead scientific argument based on fact. I'm just a regular dude. I like to drink beer, you know? I love my family. Rock, flag, and eagle, right, Charlie? He's got a point.
First, I want to look at Tenet and Inception. These movies are the only 2 original screenplays that were solely conceived by Nolan, and they actually have a lot in common. Both movies are high-concept, intellectual thrillers with a ton of surrealist imagery and narrative twists. Both have a central plot device that is introduced as military technology being leveraged by the antagonists of the movie. Both of these concepts, entropy inversion and entering dreams, are introduced almost immediately and then quickly taken up a notch. The former has its stakes up by the midpoint with the inversion of people. The second has the characters enter a dream within a dream in the opening scene. Of all of Nolan's films, they are the only 2 to include a purely fabricated science fiction element, as the occurrences in Interstellar are at least backed by theoretical astrophysics. Both Inception and Tenet introduce a talented newcomer into their respective worlds with key skills needed for the mission. They both involve secret organizations with access to secret technology and include early scenes where the protagonist must circumvent danger to meet persons with handy exposition. Both movies take strong inspiration from heist films. They both use a small trinket as a key motif that is pivotal in the film's final reveal. Both movies include significant setting jumping across the world as the characters move from country to country collecting information or team members. And in both films, an unforeseen complication in the mission results in the grave injury of one of the characters, and the team is forced to use the secret technology in an unconventional method to prolong and save the character's life. Personally, I see these as 2 of Nolan's weaker films, and I feel they both suffer from cool ideas that spun wildly out of control. In my opinion, Memento handles the non-linear story structure better than Tenet, and Interstellar tells a more cohesive, book-ended, and better character-driven science fiction movie than Inception. And I do believe that perhaps these films could have been better imagined had there been more collaboration during the writing process. Teamwork makes the dream work, if you will. I'm not trying to say Inception is a bad movie, but I think the movie's main problem is Nolan doesn't give the concept any time to breathe for the audience. Think about it, the whole idea of entering people's dreams should be thoroughly explored on its own, its impacts, its consequences. There's your first half of the movie right there. Instead, Nolan opens the fucking film with us already in a dream within a dream. We didn't have a chance to accept that the first concept is even possible before the movie shoved the second one on us. So then, when Leo decides the team should enter a dream within a dream within a dream, why should we be impressed? You can already enter 2, why not 3? Why not 10? Then he runs the exact same play at the very end by going to a fucking 4th layer of dreams. Would the movie not flow more naturally if we spent plenty of time in the beginning of the movie understanding the mechanics of dream sharing at an intro level? After all, that's a thrilling enough concept by itself. Dreams can be anything. Then, once we get a grip on the reality of this story's world, the team can devise the plan of entering a dream within a dream. If you want, you can take that to the movie's ultimate climax when they have to jump to the 3rd layer with no idea of what the consequences are. In this version of Inception, you could flesh out some more of the intriguing concepts, like how did Robert Fisher know to train his subconscious to fight off dream sharing attacks? And also you can give more time to make us question what's real and what isn't by having a couple fake out scenes that turn out to be dreams. But anyway, back to my point. The same problems here plague Tenet. Nolan just gets way too excited about his crazy idea and there's nobody to rein him in. The plot centers around machinery that can reverse the entropy of bullets, which, yeah, they're lethal, but so are regular bullets. And yet the best creative application of this technology we get is that it can destroy the world. So naturally my first thought is, how are we going to use this new inversion technology in inventive, exciting ways before ultimately finding out the answer to the question, what happens to people when they have their entropy reversed? But Nolan jumps into that in the first act. It's such an intriguing idea, but the story gets bogged down by trying to fit as many cool looking scenes in as quickly as possible. Nothing feels special if you blast it at me all at once. You compare that to Interstellar, sure, there are far out there ideas like wormholes and tesseracts and time dilation, but I fully understand the reality of this world because Nolan showed it to me carefully, and that makes it clear when something is a big deal and when it isn't.
I try to be all about story, and then as I'm writing, create visuals or situations that I actually don't know how to do. And I try to take my director's hat off when I'm writing and write things that I then come to as a director and I say, I have no idea how to do this. I have no idea what this will look like, how to visualize it. Because that's when you know you're challenging yourself. And it's through that challenge, you then put together a great team of people, and through that challenge, you find something that you haven't done before. You find something fresh and different.
If you haven't guessed already, Interstellar is one of my favorite movies in the Nolan-verse. In 2006, Steven Spielberg hired Jonathan Nolan to write the screenplay of the movie. However, when Spielberg dropped out, Jonathan took the project to his brother Christopher. It was said that Jonathan spent more than 4 years working on the script, and in an effort to learn the scientific aspects, he even studied relativity at the California Institute of Technology. This is in stark contrast to Christopher Nolan's personal philosophy on research before writing a script, which he claims he doesn't tend to do a lot of, since he's going to do what he wants regardless, whether said research confirms or contradicts what he wants to write. This seems to suggest that Jonathan Nolan has a big impact on the movies that he's participated in. And Interstellar and Memento, the two original films that he's made with his brother, are probably a better paired, critically speaking, than Inception and Tenet are. I'm also intrigued by the stories that Nolan feels are worth adapting. Lately, he seems drawn to historical events, but in the early 2000s, he was clearly inspired by fictional stories like Batman and The Prestige. And you know he handles the adaptation work with great care too, because although he had a book to work from, Chris and his brother spent 5 years on the script for The Prestige.
I was given the novel by Christopher Priest. I was given it by my executive producer, Valerie Dean, about 7 years ago. And she sort of just said to me, well, you'll see a film in it, and I did. It took a long time for my brother and myself to write the script, to figure out from this sprawling book that has so many possibilities in it, to figure out, you know, what the movie was. And I still found myself fascinated by this extraordinarily mysterious world of stage magicians at a time, working at a time when they were very, very important figures in the entertainment world.
Chris Nolan's two most critically acclaimed films are The Dark Knight and now Oppenheimer, which both happen to be adapted screenplays. I can also see some vague connections between the two narratives. Both movies portray a protagonist whose obsessive and violence-related actions ultimately create an uncontrollable, destructive problem for the world, and both have to wrestle with the consequences and whether or not what they've done was for the best or for the worst. Both protagonists lose a love interest tragically. Many applaud the lead character as a hero, but there are those who feel spiteful and vindictive towards them, and the hero himself no longer wishes to be viewed that way by the end of the film. But as we wrap up here, I have a handful of conclusions. I would argue that when Nolan is left to his own devices, he has created his most ambitious and original works, Inception and Tenet. But when Nolan collaborates tightly with others, his movies remain a little more grounded, and even the most fictitious ones remain rooted in real-world concepts and theories. 2. While there are a lot of extenuating circumstances to consider regarding the box office results of his movies, specifically Tenet, Jonathan Nolan has been a part of Christopher's most commercially successful films, The Dark Knight Rises, and Interstellar, while the next tier of his commercial successes includes both of his historical dramas. 3. Nolan's ability to adapt literature, history, and culturally significant characters has received near universal critical acclaim, with The Prestige actually receiving the lowest Rotten Tomatoes score of any of his adapted screenplays, which, if I haven't said it already, The Prestige is one of my personal favorites. 4. The stories Nolan chooses to adapt on his own have been dramatized historical events, while the screenplays he's adapted with Jonathan have been more out-there works of fiction. It's almost as if when he is working alone, he either likes complete freedom with reality, or if he is going to tackle an existing project, he wants it to be straight out of history. Even more evidence of this is his undeveloped Howard Hughes project, which he described as the best script he had ever written, but ultimately felt forced to abandon it when Martin Scorsese's The Aviator was announced. 5. His use of nonlinear storytelling has been on display in all films he's made except for The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, so it certainly appears as a non-negotiable, even when he's working with others. So what should we look out for in Nolan's next project? Well, if he is working alone, you can expect him to work on some kind of high-concept intellectual thriller. But if he adapts something, it's likely to be a historical drama based on a real story. Christopher Nolan's an absolute genius, and I enjoy each of his films in different ways. Oppenheimer really made me excited about what's next for him. And no matter what happens, I know I can enjoy stunning visuals, a powerful story, motivated cast, amazing music and sound, and a strong dedication to the movie-making craft. So thank you for jumping through his catalog of films with me today. But I am curious about your thoughts. Do you notice a difference between his more solo projects and his other films? If so, do you tend to like one group more than the other? Or have you noticed any other kinds of patterns in his movies? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thanks so much for watching.